The wire?
Yeah.
What is that?
So I just bought this engine off Craigslist. It's from a 1975 Mercedes 240D. It is an OM616.916 4-cylinder non-turbo diesel. Mechanical fuel injection. It's actually fully mechanical. The only electronic parts on it are the glow plugs. So you have to heat up the glow plugs a bit before you start it. The starter is 12 volt, and then there's an alternator to charge the battery to deal with whatever else is on the car. So the guy that I bought it from was swapping a 2JZ into his W115 Mercedes. So he didn't want this anymore. I think it's a 64 horsepower from factory, so a pretty sluggish car with the weight that it was at. I can't remember, I think I read that they were like 3,000, 4,000 pounds, somewhere in there, 64 horsepower. This one came with a 4-speed manual transmission. I think they kind of barely do freeway speeds, but I've never driven one, so I don't really know. I don't really know what I want to do with it yet. I just thought it was a really interesting engine. Hopefully I can find something that's super old, maybe like a Model A, something like that, that it'll go in, which 64 horsepower in a Model A is still like double what it had from factory, so it shouldn't be that bad. It's also, that would also be a lot lighter than the Mercedes that this came out of. This has a mechanical vacuum pump, because the Mercedes use a lot of vacuum actuated stuff, and the diesels don't provide vacuum very well, so they have a separate mechanical vacuum pump to provide vacuum for that stuff. Power steering pump I'll probably remove. This is the fuel filter, oil filter down there, mechanical injection pump. This has a really interesting way of handling throttle. It's kind of different than some other diesels I've read, so that'll be interesting. I'll learn some stuff about that. Previous owner said the starter doesn't work, starter went out, and so that's why he started his 2JZ swap instead of fixing this one, so we'll have to look into that and see what's up with the starter. It's leaking a bit of oil, so we'll fix all that, but essentially what I just want to do to start out is put it on a test stand and see if we can get it running, and then once it's running we'll go through and clean a bunch of stuff up and get it ready to go into whatever we find to put it in. So let's get that test stand and mount it up and see if we can get it running. So this is the test stand I built. Basically it's just 2" by 2" steel square tubing that was out back that was used for another project years ago, but it's just been sitting out there, so it's essentially scrap, just a rectangle. The wheels are 10" Harbor Freight casters, and then the back wheels, I put a little weld on them right there so they're no longer casters, and so only one side of it turns. And then I also added these triangles with the tubes inside, and that gives an attachment point for a handle so that you can run it around like a wagon kind of. Had this old dolly that was all bent up, so I just cut the handle off of it, welded on these tubes to fit some quick releases in them. And now it's like a wagon almost. You can push it around wherever it needs to go. I made it big enough so that the engine fits through the hole in the rectangle, so you can basically set the dolly on top of it. At first I had the steering wheels up on the front of the engine, but there was so much weight on the front that it was hard to steer. So I flipped it around, and the steering wheels go on the back of the transmission. So that's about where it sits right there. From there, we're just gonna install the transmission mount, and then we'll jack up the engine and install the engine mounts to the frame. So this is the transmission mount. This is the Mercedes part. This is just a piece of angle aluminum that I cut out. It was a giant piece of angle. And then I just cut that big U out of it and trimmed the front so that it's just not so giant. And then found some bolts that go into the Mercedes mount since it didn't come with them, so I had to go buy those bolts special. Luckily the old Mercedes mount was still on the transmission when I bought the engine and transmission. So I got the nut and washer that are supposed to be there. And then these two bolts just bolt through the frame, right there and right there. So we'll just install this on the transmission first and then bolt it to the test stand. Alright, this is the side mount, and so here's your factory engine mount. This style top, I think this was last year, 1975, and it could be different depending on the engine you have. So at 75 there was either mount style, and this happens to be the older one, so I actually couldn't find it locally. I had to get it online. Then I just have a piece of flat plate roughly traced out to the bottom of the mount, a couple bolts through it, and then this is more of the square tubing that I used to build the rectangle for the test stand, and then just a piece of angle, and that goes right on the test stand rail. It's pretty simple. It's as simple as I could make it. It's just a test stand after all, but this would even work in a car. So from here I have to jack the engine up and get it off the jack stands in order to slide the mount in. So it's kind of just balancing there. And you can see we're off a little bit, so let's pull that in. Alright, let me show you around it a little bit. So on the fuel pump, we have fuel in right here, little inline filter. This is the priming pump to prime the rest of it to get the air out of the system. So it comes in here, out the priming pump, into the fuel filter. This is the fuel filter. Out the top of the fuel filter, there is one feed line that goes into the injection pump. So that feeds the main injection pump, and I can't remember the pressure this puts out. I think it's something like 2,000 psi about that this pump does, or at least the injectors release at 2,000 psi. Then one tube for each injector. This other tube coming back into the fuel filter is actually returned, so excess fuel comes out the fourth injector to the third, to the second, to the first, and back into the return. That's any excess. Then there's a tube here that would go back to your fuel tank that returns the excess. So you have in from the fuel tank, out to the fuel tank, out to the injectors. It's fairly simple. This is a vacuum tube that controls throttle, and on the back, that arm is something to do with idle, something about smoothness or idle smoothness. I'm not really 100% sure. Maybe we'll find out later. And then this lever on the fuel pump is the shutoff. And then down a bit lower here we have the oil filter, bolt on the bottom to remove it because it's like a replaceable cartridge. And then these two fittings are capped off oil cooler lines, which is not recommended for these cars, but somebody in the past has capped off these lines and removed the oil cooler So we'll probably have to add that back, but it should run fine without the oil cooler for now, and most likely either the oil cooler failed or the oil lines failed. It created an oil leak, and this was their solution, was to cut out the oil cooler. This fitting right here is going to be the oil pressure. These cars had a mechanical oil pressure gauge in the dash, so a line would have run from here up into the dash and fed oil directly to the gauge that you look at. We're going to have to do something about this, because if we don't, oil will squirt out of there. Each of these inside the head are the glow plugs. This is an updated style of glow plug. These aren't the glow plugs that would have come on this engine initially, but they are better than the ones that came with it, assuming they all work. Basically, we just put 12 volts here, and it'll feed 12 volts to all the injector, or all the glow plugs. They'll heat up, and then we can start the engine. And then this metal part specifically right there, that is the injector. Out here, this is one of the heater outlet, the water outlet for the heater. Would have gone to the dash, I believe. Since I never had one of these cars, I don't 100% know, but that basically goes to the heater. There's a sensor up front here. That's the water temperature sensor. There's another sensor over here on top of the thermostat housing that looks like a water temperature sensor. It is a water temperature sensor, but it's not for the gauge on the dash. It's to turn on the auxiliary fan. I guess these had an auxiliary electric fan on the radiator, so if this switch decides it's too hot, that fan gets turned on. So we don't really need to hook up that switch unless we add an auxiliary fan or something like that. But we would get our temperature reading from the other switch on the side of the other sensor on the side of the head. This is the mechanical vacuum pump that's gear driven off of, I believe, the same gear that runs the injection pump. I could be wrong about that, but it looks like it's in about that same position. So this is sucking air in one hole and blowing it out the other hole. I'm not really sure which one. I don't really know if I even need a vacuum pump on the car that I'm going to put it on. So one option is we can run this line into here and then it will be doing nothing, or we can just remove the vacuum pump altogether and make some sort of cover for that hole, and then we won't have it anymore. Power steering pump right below probably also will not use in whatever car, so that can be removed too at some point. For the first start, we'll probably at least just take the belt off the power steering pump so that it doesn't throw oil everywhere. So we have our thermostat housing here. This is the timing chain tensioner. We'll need to check the condition of the timing chain at some point. This is the other tube for the heater. So this would be a water line back from the heater. Throttle butterflies in here. These help provide the information that the injection pump needs to determine how much fuel to add. And then the second butterfly in here is actually a shutoff, and I think it's a shutoff in case the engine starts up backwards. This will automatically close whichever way it is and shut the engine off, or not let it run backwards, because then air would be blowing out here. And then obviously alternator and starter, both are unknown condition. Previous owner said the starter doesn't work, so we're gonna have to check that out. Alright, so first things first, we're not going to start the engine if it won't turn over, and the previous owner said that the starter was having problems. So let's see what's going on here. I have a battery. This was a battery that I salvaged. I tried to revive it, so it is of questionable quality. It is showing 12 volts. So we should be able to use this ground cable as the ground for the whole thing, and it's actually isolated right now from the cart, so the cart would not be a good ground. At some point I probably do want to tie it in. Maybe we'll bolt this to the cart or something, and then the cart can be a ground also, chassis ground kind of thing. But right now the cart's isolated via the engine mounts. We want the best connection possible, so I'm going to hook up directly to the starter. So this bottom one should be the ground, and the top one should be the power. And as long as I don't touch them to each other, it should be fine. If they're not touching, it's okay. Positive here on the battery, and negative. No sparks, that's good. Negative right there. I can hook up the voltmeter just so we can watch it. This contact right here should energize the whole thing. So if I clip one end of this wire to the positive on the battery and touch this point on the starter should go and the engine should turn. So I'll just tap it there real quick to see what happens. We got a decent spark, and then I'll push it. It sparked, but nothing really moved in the starter. So you know there's a load, or there's something trying to happen, but we didn't get something. So I'm going to hold it on there for a sec. We get nothing. Voltage drops down. And back up. So it dropped 0.3 volts or so. And nothing moved in the starter. I don't really know enough about the starter to know what potentially could be wrong, so maybe we'll have to take it off and take it apart and see what's up. I feel like either it should force the shaft out, or it should spin. It should do one of them if there was a problem, but both shouldn't fail. So potentially there are two problems. But like I said, I don't know enough about the starter to tell. Worst case scenario, I gotta go get another starter. But I think I'm gonna try to pull it off and see if I can figure out whatever's wrong with it first before I go and buy a starter, because they're kind of expensive. So I just noticed the Napa remanufactured sticker still on here, so I'm going to take this over to Napa and see if they will give me a new one without me having to pay, instead of taking this apart. If they won't give me a new one, I'll still try to take this one apart. Nope, there we go. Alright, it's a few days later, and as you can see, Napa did give me a new starter with no receipt. So just another reman Napa starter, which you know, there may be other better choices out there, but this one was free, so I'm gonna stick with this one. And today's not the day we get to tear apart a starter. But this one does work. So let's throw it back on the car, or no car, let's throw it back on the engine and make sure it turns the engine over. I'm sure it will. Alright, let's see if the engine wants to turn now. Got this vacuum line hitting the fan. So this battery's dead. It's I tried to revive it. I could throw it on a charger and we'll probably get better results after a day or so. But I also don't want to turn the engine very much because it has no oil at all leaked out into the pan down there. So at least we know the starter's gonna work. So we do need to worry about the battery. We need to get a power supply that's good enough on here. But we don't have to worry about the starter anymore. So we can move on to something else. So I think I might want to remove the power steering pump, but we need to remove the power steering pump and figure out fuel and oil pressure gauge so that we can block off that oil pressure line that's open. So that's what we'll do next. Alright, I want to get this power steering pump off now. Looks like there's a couple bolts missing off the backside. I don't know if the whole thing will come off with the bracket or if the pump has to come out first, but we'll find out here. So the bracket is stuck under another bracket. Which look, it looks like it's broken. See that? The bracket looks like it's broken up there. Maybe it's not, but this lower bracket needs to come back so that it could, so this one will come off. Maybe we could pry it forward. So it looks like the bottom of this bracket, which bracket comes down, around, and then back up. I don't really know what was bolted here since I never had the car. But it looks like the bottom of it is bolted in 3 places with the bolts on the front of the oil pan, so I have to take those front oil pan bolts out. You can see there's one nut right there, one right there, and there's one back here, pretty greasy. Let me get those out, and then I think that the whole bracket will bend forward enough to get the power steering pump out, and then we just put the bolts back in. Alright, got those 3 bolts out. It's quite dirty down there. Let's see if we can get somewhere now. Alright, so for fuel on the cart, I just got this glass jar with a metal lid, and then I got some aluminum fittings. All I'm going to do is just drill holes in here, put the aluminum fittings in. It's probably even overkill, but that's what I want to do. The engine's probably going to be on the cart for a while, so I kind of want to make something that's going to work for a little bit. Alright, I just did this with a unibit. Really good fit on there. These are just old AN fittings from airplanes that have been taken apart. Alright, I ended up having to put a little washer on there because on these AN fittings there is a little step at the base that is thicker than this lid, so it wasn't allowing it to seat all the way down, so I had to add a little washer to get some extra space out of it. Alright, so there's all 3. So we're gonna have, one's gonna be fuel out to the engine, one's gonna be a return from the injectors, so excess, and then this one's just gonna be a vent so that it doesn't end up with vacuum or pressure or something. So now I just need to connect. I have a scrap of tubing here, and I'm gonna see if I can get it to fit over here. If not, I'll figure out something else. I have to get some different tubing. I actually think it's on there pretty good. There's our fuel bottle. Ow! That is hot. But it's not going to come off. Alright, to mount this jar up here, I just found an extra bolt, and this hole was already actually here, and then a piece of steel. I'm just going to bolt this here. Alright, that's on there pretty good. About as tight as we want to get it. Ow, hot. As a return, this is from the bottle here and into the primary, this whatever you call it, fuel filter. It's a little too close there. That's not going to work. You have to make that a lot shorter. Yeah, that might not even work. Like it definitely will work. I just don't know if it can suck enough fuel. And another thing I didn't think about is now the lid won't come off for me to fill fuel. Maybe it will. Yeah, I guess it will. Actually, we don't even have to have the lid on to run it. So the next thing we need to take care of is this oil pressure line. I found an old gauge. Just salvaged from an airplane at some point. And then with the gauge you need a pressure sender, and for that we need an adapter. The original Mercedes stuff would have had the oil line going straight to the gauge, which I like, but I don't have a gauge, so I have to do something else, and this we have laying around. There's the adapter, 1/8 inch NPT to M14 by 1.5, which is the engine side. So the adapter has a copper washer on that side for sealing, and then on the pressure sender it's a tapered thread, so it seals itself. Alright, well, assuming I didn't just trash the threads, that's on there. Now we need to wire it. So for this gauge, all we need is the S is for sensor, I think, plus power, and then that's the symbol for ground. So this is going to be my sensor wire. Sensor, and then just some old speaker wire here for power and ground. I'll just send those straight to the battery. On this particular oil sender, the terminals are labeled WK and G, I think. WK is for the warning light, so if you have a warning light on your dash for low oil pressure, you use that terminal. And then the G terminal is for the actual oil pressure signal. Alright, there we go, temporary oil pressure gauge. Just need to wire it into the battery now. Also added a wire onto the glow plugs here. So we'll just touch that to the battery. Alright, I think we're ready. Almost. I got the transmission into neutral. Oil pressure gauge is ready. Glow plugs are ready. We need fuel. We need oil. For the oil, I just bought the cheapest stuff I could get. Since we'd have to do the oil pan gasket and everything anyways, so we're just going to be draining it. I think the oil capacity on this is like 6 liters. Since we didn't empty the oil filter, it's a little bit less, so this might actually be enough right here. Check it. A little bit more. Okay, oil's good. Alright, now some fuel. I do think this fuel line's gonna work, at least for now. I'll probably change it later though. This fuel line got wet in the fitting and it's like loose now, so these fuel lines may not even work at all. We'll see once the fuel gets in there. If it's just gonna let go, then we might be done with this fuel line. Alright, let's see if that'll work. Alright, I got another battery. Hopefully this one's gonna cooperate. Alright, here's our glow plug wire. And here's our oil pressure gauge. Just plug this in permanently here. We need to prime, one more thing. This rod right here is part of the throttle, and sometimes this thing was getting stuck on the transmission there, like that. So you get stuck full throttle. Not ideal. I'm gonna put something here so that it doesn't get stuck. Alright, that might work. Alright, now all that's left is prime the fuel, and I think we can start it. Alright, I've never done this before, but I guess you open this, and then pumps, you can see it going into the filter. This thing's leaking a bunch of fuel, which I guess is common on these older ones, so it's gonna have to be rebuilt. Now it's coming out the return here and getting dumped back in the bottle. Alright, so I'm gonna say that's that. And then we need to crack the injectors and see if we'll spin the engine over and get fuel to come out the injectors, and then we'll tighten them back up, and then it should be good to start up. Alright, we need to prime the injectors. So I've got the nuts all loosened, and then I'm just going to turn the engine over, and when fuel starts coming out of the injectors, we can close them up and it should be good to go. Wow, that battery doesn't feel too good, even on that one. And I just bought it as a used battery. So I'm gonna have to sort out this battery situation, so give me a minute here. Alright, I'm pretty sure the problem is just the connection because I'm using jumper cables. I should be using like bolted on battery cables, and so the connection is just poor. I added a second set of jumper cables and a battery charger at the same time. So we'll see if that gets us there. It's turning over faster, but I don't think it's going fast enough. So if this doesn't work, I'll probably have to fabricate some cables and then we'll try again. Oh, I think number 3 might actually be leaking a bit already. Yeah, 3's leaking, 4's leaking, 2's leaking. I don't see 1. Let me close these. Turn over some more for 1. There it goes, I see it. Battery charger's helping for sure. Alright, now we've got fuel all the way in. Oil is good, we have oil. I think it's ready to start now. Alright, we're gonna glow plugs for like 10 to 15 seconds.
Scared the shit out of me.
Our ground wire fell off. Got some black smoke, it tried. This is too much load for this wire. It's like getting soft.
The wire?
Yeah.
What is that?
was super cool. Let's try that again. The oil pressure wasn't the best. All right, well, I think it's probably warm now, so I'm gonna leave it there. At this point, I think I'm pretty happy with it. One thing is the oil pressure was showing like a little bit low at idle compared to other videos I've seen, but those other videos are using the stock Mercedes mechanical oil gauge. So they may be showing different numbers or whatever. When this thing revved up, it still went up to pretty high pressure. So it may be good. I just don't know like what this gauge should be showing. There is a decent oil leak, but we already knew that. So there's a bunch of stuff we want to do now, which is like oil filter, fuel filter, check the timing chain, do the valve adjustment, you know, all that maintenance stuff to get it ready to go into whatever we're going to put it into. So if you want to see that stuff, you know what to do.